Amber, Amber works at the University of York in the well-renowned chemistry department there, and she's a postdoctoral researcher, but has a significant body of work on indoor releases of VOCs, broadly speaking. And I'll hand over now to Amber to tell you far more. Amber, over to you.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'll just share my slides with you all. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Here we go. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. Please wave at me if you can't.
Yeah, I can see those. That's good.
Fantastic. Yep, so thank you very much. Yes, I'm Amber Yeoman. I work at the Wolfson Atmospheric Chemistry Laboratories, which is part of the chemistry department at York. So we're basically a group of about 80 people looking at all different areas of air quality. That's everyone from academics to postdoctoral researchers, research technicians, PhD, BSc, master's students. So there's quite a lot of us here. And I work as part of a slightly smaller team who started looking at indoor air quality a few years ago, and I lead the research program on consumer product VOC emissions. I started this work about 5 years ago when I started my PhD here, which took me about 3 years, and then for the past 2 years I've been developing this work past my thesis during my postdoc. So I thought I'd just start by introducing, the importance of indoor air quality, why we're looking at it, and why it's so different to outdoor air quality. You may have known that in 2022, the Chief Medical Officer's annual report was focused on air pollution. And there was a really good quote in there. Indoor air pollution is important because over 80% of a typical adult day is spent indoors. Despite this, we have much less knowledge about the sources and people's exposure to indoor air pollution and a less well-developed plan for reducing it. And to be honest, there isn't really much more that I can add to this. It really, explains the point particularly well, that we've got 50 plus years of research on outdoor air quality, loads of policies on outdoor air quality, but really we need to be focusing our attention on indoor as well, because that's where we breathe most of our air. So just a little look at the sort of landscape at the moment of VOC emissions in the UK. So that's volatile organic compounds. So this is a plot showing the total UK anthropogenic VOC trends from the 60s through to 2018. It's the percentage contribution of different sectors VOC emissions. And you can see that there's been quite a drastic change in the sources of the significant sources of VOC emissions since about the late 90s. You see there's a huge drop here in the orange in transport VOC emissions, which corresponds to a big increase in the VOC emissions from solvent use. Now, solvents are used in all consumer products. It's very rare that you'd ever find one that won't have a solvent in. They're a very important part of the delivery of a product. So anything from delivering a fragrance compound in a washing up liquid to the moisturizing agent in a skin cream, they all need to be delivered by solvents, so they're particularly important to that sector. So this huge increase in solvent use, quite a lot of that is to do with the emissions that are coming from consumer products. The difference between these sectors is quite interesting, is that the other VOCs, so transport, agriculture and so on, industrial processes, are traditional outdoor sources of VOC emissions, whereas our solvent use, we're starting to move towards the most significant source of our VOC emissions being indoor sources. So we need to change the way that we look and we measure our VOC pollutants. So as I said, consumer products are a very large source of indoor air pollution, not just from solvents, from other VOCs as well. And when I'm talking about consumer products, what I mean are any sort of cosmetics or toiletries or cleaning products, or anything that you can go to a supermarket as a member of the public and buy and use. they're not particularly well regulated or regulated at all for air quality. They're quite innocuous. People don't think twice about using them. And we're all very, very familiar with them. The main focus of my work is to measure and understand what the both qualitative and quantitative VOC emissions from these products are, so that we can then go on to try and understand what the health impacts of these VOCs might be when we're breathing them in indoor air. Any secondary chemistry that might be happening. So the secondary chemistry that happens indoors is very different to those that we know about and we understand in outdoor air. They may also produce more dangerous VOCs and other secondary products like formaldehyde on particulate matter, which are also detrimental to health, particularly in indoor environments. And generally, we need to have a better understanding of overall indoor air quality and how consumer products feed into that. So this is a little look at the emissions from different sectors, different types, categories of consumer products. So some of this data has come from the NAAI, that's the National Atmospheric Emissions Inventory, which actually isn't particularly well speciated for indoor sources. It's very well speciated for outdoor sources, particularly transport, but not for indoors. So we've actually supplemented this data with some of the lab work that we've been carrying out. So what this shows on the left-hand side is we have the different types of consumer products, most of them being indoor sources, screen washed, perhaps not so much, you don't tend to use that indoors. And then on the right-hand side, we have the different or the most prominent VOCs that are emitted from these products. And it just shows sort of the flow between the category of product and the VOCs that are being emitted. So undoubtedly, ethanol is the biggest VOC or most significant VOC that is emitted from these consumer products. But if you look on the other side of the plot, you can see that actually combined, it's aerosols, so cosmetics and toiletries, car care, and household aerosol products, the biggest sector for emissions, VOC emissions from consumer products. So this is a really interesting plot. As I say, it's not particularly well speciated, and this is all sort of going off of assumptions that have been made about the VOC emissions from consumer products, because at the moment we don't have a particularly detailed understanding of the emissions. So this may not be particularly accurate. So as I was saying, so the biggest source we believe to be aerosol products, and that is reflected quite well when you measure it against indoor studies. So in 2019, a colleague of mine, PhD at the student here at the Wolfson Atmospheric Chemistry Laboratories, carried out some studies inside people's homes. So whilst I look at the products from the source, he was doing studies taking air canisters from inside of people's homes, bringing them back to the lab and then analysing them from of their VOCs. So I think about 60 different homes had samples taken from them. And this plot shows the most significant VOCs that were identified in every home. So as you can see, we've got butane, N and isobutane, propane and ethanol were the biggest VOCs that were identified in all 60 homes. And that's not surprising because we know that the butane and the propane is coming from our aerosol sprays, and the ethanol is the most commonly used solvent in these products. So our data is starting to match up. It looks like, aerosols are really the most significant sector that we need to focus on. It is particularly difficult, however, to measure aerosol products. And I'll go into that a little bit later, but I've spent the better part of 5 years attempting to measure the VOC emissions and understand the speciation from aerosol products using lab data. And what we've had to go on previously is data that we've managed to find during lit review. So this is actually some work that I did during my PhD during lockdown, which is very useful because I didn't need to be in the lab for it. It was all a literature review type project. Generally, when you're looking at consumer products, it's very difficult to know what is being used, how much is being used, because manufacturers don't want to tell you that data, obviously for trade secrets and other purposes. However, there's an organisation called the British Aerosol Manufacturers Association, which do actually provide quite detailed data on the consumption and the filling of aerosol products in the UK, which is absolutely fantastic. It gives us a little bit of an understanding of how much we're using in the UK. So we decided to go ahead and do this lit review and try and calculate how big the emissions might be from these aerosol products alone from their propellant use. This plot that you see here, it's pretty much the same as the first plot that I showed you. It's showing the change in our total UK anthropogenic VOC emissions from 1990. But what I've done here is I've taken out, this is in kilotons, by the way, I've taken out at the top there, in the red, this is our aerosols. And it doesn't look like it's particularly significant, especially not in terms of, you know, the entire solvent sector. But when you convert that into percentage VOC, you can see that we're actually at around 6 or 7% of total UK anthropogenic VOC emissions coming just from these aerosol products, which are predominantly being used indoors. Again, that may not seem like a huge statistic to you, but that is actually more than the VOC emissions in terms of percentage that are being emitted from the entire transport fleet in the UK. So actually, although 6-7% doesn't seem like a lot, it's actually quite significant when you look at other sources. Now, the reason that there has been this huge increase since the 1990s to today comes from two reasons. The first being that we've done such a fantastic job at reducing the VOC emissions from other sources, particularly you can see in the green sectors here, there's a fuel combustion activities and fugitive emissions from fuels. The second reason is there's been a huge increase in the popularity of aerosol products. There's more aerosol products on the market than there ever has been, and the population is bigger. And when you combine those things, what you end up getting is people buying and using far more products than they ever have done, at least in the UK. Luckily for us, BAMA, the British Aerosol Manufacturers Association, they don't just give us the data on how much is being used and consumed in the UK. They break it down by category, which is really useful to us because, of course, every product isn't going to have the same VOC emissions. So this is some, I suppose, some interesting data on the usage or fillings of the can of aerosol products from the 1960s to present day. Which doesn't tell us much in terms of air quality, but there's a few interesting bits that you can pick out of there, like the increase in the use of hairspray in the 80s and things like that. But what we really need to understand is what this means in terms of VOCs. So we've had to apply some assumptions here, not being able to do these measurements in the lab, particularly over lockdown. So we've applied assumptions to this data based on the size of a can and the amount of propelling that the product will need to do. So not all products will have the same amount of VOC propellant in them. For example, an air freshener, which needs to be sprayed quite widely into a room, is going to have quite a high percentage of propellant, whereas something like a shaving cream is not going to need quite so much propellant. You don't need that to go very far. You just want to have that in your hand. So we've had to apply all these assumptions and sort of try to give an overview of what the propellant VOCs might be in terms of kilotons of aerosol product fillings in the UK, which is what you can see here. So before you had some quite what seemed like bigger sectors, so colognes in the red there, and shaving creams. But when you put it in terms of propellant, they almost disappear. They're quite small, and things that you probably wouldn't be too surprised at, deodorants, hairsprays, and air fresheners make up quite a big chunk of that. So this is what's happening in the UK, but a lot of what is produced in the UK is exported, and these trends we see, all across the globe. So, what would the global emissions look like? What does this mean in terms of global usage and global VOC emissions from aerosol products? Luckily, I managed to find a bit of data from other nations, not quite as good, not quite as speciated as the stuff from the UK. But we found some trends in terms of countries' gross national income. So those countries like the UK that are high income have sort of plateaued at a usage of 10 cans per person per year. So the increase in aerosol use is only really down to a population increase. Whereas countries which are upper middle income, so Thailand, Brazil, Mexico, they've got they're not using as many products at the moment, but they are increasing in their usage, and they're looking to, or they look like they will increase to 10 cans per person per year by the year 2050. So we used all of this data, and we used predictions on population, what they're going to be from 2022 to 2050, to try to calculate rather big uncertainties, I might add, what we think the global aerosol product consumption and VOC emissions will be today and then in the future by 2050. So it's looking as though, I mean, we predicted that by the year 2050, there'll be 2.2 teragrams per year of VOCs emitted from aerosol propellants, which is about a 70% increase from present day. Now, that is quite a lot. It goes to show, you know, that we really need to be intervening in some way, whether that be by product reformulation by the manufacturers, different behavior changes in terms of people using these products, and, you know, public awareness of how big the emissions from these products are, or whether that be by regulation, either governmental or you know, intergovernmental on a larger scale. So aerosol products, as I've said, we've had to do all this based on lit review, really, really difficult to sample. But just because they're difficult to sample doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. Because at the moment, we don't really know where to focus policy. So, for example, yes, VOC propellants, the propane and the butane, are the biggest chunk of the VOC emissions. But if you're looking at indoor air quality, they perhaps might be as reactive as, say, the fragrance compounds, which are very small. You don't need a lot of them. So we really need to understand what is in these products and what the actual total emissions are. As we do, you know, every 5 years or so for transport emissions, we feed them into the NAEI, and that can influence policy because we can see the trends. We really need to be, you know, figuring out this sector a lot better. So, as I've said, 5 years in the lab trying to work this out. There's a few reasons why aerosols are really difficult to sample. The first is that you can't weigh them, which makes it really difficult to understand how much you've got in a can. Secondly, the minute that you spray them, you lose them. So you have to try and keep them in an enclosed environment. Another thing is it's really difficult to introduce contaminant species, which we don't want to do. There's been quite a lot of stuff, particularly in the media recently, about there being contaminants such as benzene found in aerosol products, mostly over in the US, where they have different fillings and different stock feeds for their propellants. It's really important that we're not misreporting this, both in terms of our reputation and not getting sued, but also for the manufacturers. They don't want to, you know, we don't want to ruin their reputation by saying that they've got all these contaminants in. So there is a lot of stuff out there at the moment about this, but actually there isn't still a really accurate, confirmed way of measuring these VOCs. As I say, we're working on it, and I can't say too much about it because we haven't quite got the data yet. We're very, very close. We should be publishing soon. But basically what we've got is this in-house built 2-meter cubed chamber. It's a bit like a telephone box, and it means that we can introduce sample into it in a realistic manner. And then this is measured by GC-MS. So as I say, I really wish I could talk more about this yet, but we're not quite there yet. But hopefully the plan is to start to inform the emissions inventory more accurately and update that year on year, so that we can influence policy decisions and hopefully improve the emissions of VOCs from aerosols, which are, as I say, a huge sector. Having said that, aerosol products are not the only products that emit VOCs. They are not the only things that influence indoor air quality. Non-aerosol products, so anything that's like a liquid or cream or gel, It's basically not a solid really. We can sample and they impact on indoor air quality too. Luckily for me, these are so much easier to sample, and we've got quite a rigorous technique that we've been developing to measure these emissions. So a bit of an example of what I've been doing. So what we tend to do is we take a product class. The one that I've done recently is sunscreens. We measure headspace emissions off of them, and then we, qualitatively and quantitatively assess the VOCs that are coming off of them. So the plot that I've got here is some tests we did. It was headspace, QTOF-GC MS for 26 different liquid-based sunscreen products that we just bought from, supermarkets, drugstores, things like that. So widely available, people use them all the time. And across the top of this plot are the 26 different products that we sampled. And down the side, we have all the VOC species that we were able to identify. And the colours just show the different categories that I've sort of arbitrarily given these, just to sort of try and organise them a little bit easier. So you see things that you would expect. We've got quite a lot of solvents there in the purple, predominantly ethanol, but then the things that are used to denature the ethanol, propyl alcohol, acetone, things like that. That's no surprise at all. In the orange at the bottom, you've got your fragrance compounds. There are hundreds of thousands of different fragrance compounds, so we only report them as fragrance. It makes it a lot easier. At least for this primary work, we don't particularly need to know every single fragrance compound, although usually they're mostly monoterpenes. But then you also find lots of things that you wouldn't normally recognise or wouldn't think would impact on indoor air quality or even be emitted, even when you're looking at the back of a packaging, of your product when you're looking through the ingredients. So for example, humectants, emollients and conditioners, they're all used in consumer products quite widely, and they can all be volatile at room temperature or skin temperature, which is what we measure them at in a realistic environment, because if it's not emitted at the usage temperature, then then we're not interested in it. If something only emits at 100 degrees, then well, it's probably not going to be very realistic, and we don't need to know. There's things like preservatives that are volatile that are added into these products, but also things like the active ingredients. So for example, with these sunscreens, you've got the UV blockers, the things that are put in there to actually stop you being in contact with the UV. And we also find, I've touched upon this a little bit, we do find contaminant species in there. Now, we define these as VOCs that we don't believe have been intentionally added to the product in terms of improving their formulation or as part of their formulation. So these are things, so benzene and ethyl benzene, xylenes and toluenes. And this headspace QTOF-GC MS is really good at accurately identifying these, and it means that we can be quite sure in what we're seeing. They could be coming from anywhere. They could be coming from the feedstocks. They could be, from the packaging. They might be reacting. You might be fine when you've packaged it, but it might be reacting, during its shelf life. We don't know where these things are stored always, different warehouses and whatnot. They're never in particularly big amounts, but they can be there, and it's not done on purpose, but it's interesting. Although we're not particularly interested in the contaminants specifically, we don't go out and test products and try and find things that are wrong with them. They do crop up quite regularly in our work. Now, what we would assume, I suppose, is that all products that are produced for the same purpose, so 26 sunscreens, they're all used for the same thing. They're supposed to be put on your skin and protect you from the sun. You would think that they would all have quite similar emissions profiles, but what we can see from this plot is that that's really not true. We cannot generalize the emissions even from one product class. Now, there are thousands or hundreds of thousands of different consumer products of a basically unknown and varying composition that we use frequently in indoor environments. If you think about, all the different things that you see on a shelf, one product that's, exactly the same product, but has different fragrances, don't just have different fragrance VOCs, they have a completely different formulation in terms of their VOC profile. So that makes it really difficult for us if we're trying to make these generalizations and inform emissions inventories, unless we actually go and test every single one of these products in the lab. It also makes it very difficult if we're trying to model indoor air quality, because we can't assume that any of these one products will emit a certain thing or even at a certain concentration. So once we've sort of have an understanding of qualitatively of the sorts of VOCs that are emitted from our products, we then use a second technique in order to calculate an emission rate so that we can work out the total VOCs that are emitted. And in order to do that, we use selected ion flow tube mass spectrometry. Now, this is a technique that I suppose is not widely known about. I don't think a lot of people use this or know about it. It's a bit like PCR-MS. It's a real-time soft ionization mass spectrometry technique. So what that means is that we can measure VOCs in real time and see its emission profile across the time of measuring. So again, we do headspace analysis on these. The way that it works is it's called selected ion because it selects between 3 different reagent ions here in the flow tube. The sample is introduced to it, and then it detects the VOCs on the other end. We actually use the qualitative data that we get from the QTOF to inform which of the VOCs we're going to analyze. So we select the ones that you want to look at. Because it's a soft ionization technique, it can't give us that full speciation that we find with the QTOF. But this one works as a really good complementary technique because we're able to calculate emission rates from it. So very simply, what we do is we have sort of a stainless steel gas-tight container where we put a very, very tiny amount of our product into, normally 0.01 grams. We don't need a lot at all. And they're very potent in their VOC emissions. We sit it on a hot plate and we heat it up to either room temperature if it's a product that's going to be used in the room, or if it's a temperature that's going to be used on the skin or in the shower, we heat it up to maybe 35, 40 degrees, depending on its usage scenario. This container is connected to a high purity supply of nitrogen, and then it sweeps across the top into the SIFT-MS, and that's how we get our measurements. And you can see this is an example of one of the plots we got. So generally with products you find the really volatile ones, they come off immediately, and then sometimes ones that are a little bit stickier like cyclosiloxanes, they tend to come off a bit more slowly. So it's really interesting to see this emission profile and how the amount of time that a product is being used affects its VOC emissions. So from this data, we're able to calculate emission factors by using the area under the curve. And we calculate this data in terms of micrograms per second of product used per gram of product used. So this plot shows, again, our sunscreen products, the emission factors that we calculated for 15 VOCs of interest. Now, we pick these VOCs based on a few things. If we see that they're coming up again and again in the type of products that we've analysed, we put it in. So unsurprisingly for these ones, you're going to see a lot of ethanol. You see a lot of these cyclosiloxanes, which are sort of sticky, slippy things that, are good for conditioning, and they're very volatile. So they're good for, things that are going to go on the skin or hair. We do also pick out things that we think might be of concern. So for example, our benzene and toluene and things like that we think are contaminants. And as I've said before about the generalization of the types of VOCs that are emitted, what we see from this data is that you actually can't generalize the concentration of VOCs that are being emitted from these products either. You see there's quite a wide range in emissions, particularly, if we take decamethyl tetrasiloxane, for example, the range in different emission factors from just 26 products for that one VOC is absolutely huge. So like I say, keep repeating the same point, but yeah, it's really difficult to generalize what is being emitted into indoor air from consumer products. Because we calculate these emission factors in terms of micrograms per second of use per gram of product use, it means that we can apply usage scenarios to get the total VOC that might be emitted. So for example, for a sunscreen product, the time used is going to be the full time over which it is emitted, because it's not a product that's washed off. So you put it on your skin and it will be allowed to completely volatilize. If we're measuring, say, a shampoo, for example, those are usually only used for maybe a few minutes before they're washed off, if that. So that means that the time over which they're emitting will be slightly shorter when we calculate emissions. And then we've got the unit or the variable for the amount of product used, obviously quite simple. The more product you use, the more VOCs you're going to be emitting. So we can apply, we call them usage scenarios. We can apply them to this data based on typical usage, and try and work out what might be emitted into the room. So these are for total VOCs emitted into the room, which anybody in a room is going to be exposed to those VOCs. Doesn't matter whether you've used it or how long ago it was. If you go into the room, you're going to be exposed. However, somebody that is using the products themselves has a higher will have a higher inhalation dose to those emissions because of how close they are. Particularly if it's a product like a moisturizer or a sun cream, which you're applying to your face. Close to the fancy term for it is the inhalation exposure pathway. It's basically your nose and your mouth. So if you're applying something directly to your face, you're going to inhale quite a large proportion of it. So we wanted to try and see if we could accurately replicate usage, particularly for these facial products. So the way that we got around this was by using what we have termed our beauty product application replica and basic airway reconstruction accessory. In simple terms, this is basically a mannequin's head that we got off of Amazon. We've stuck 2 holes in the nose and the mouth, which we've put tubing into. This tubing is then connected to a scroll pump, which replicates the average rate of respiration, which is 6 litres per minute. And we then connect that onto our SIFT. We then cover the mannequin with a clean sheet of parafilm, and then we apply our product as realistically as possible so that we can measure what would be directly inhaled if you were to be the applicant yourself. And basically what we find from this is that we directly inhale about 40% of the VOCs that are emitted from facial consumer products. And this is quite interesting because there is no regulation for products in terms of their VOC emissions. So obviously when you look at the back of a product, there will be perhaps recommendations such as what to do if you have an allergic reaction. So that's a dermal exposure. What to do if you get it in your eyes, also dermal exposure. But then if you accidentally ingest it, what to do, who to call, the procedures to take. But there's never anything about the inhalation exposure. And manufacturers are not required in any way to assess the VOCs that are emitted from their product, both in terms of inhalation, but also in terms of their environmental impact. So if they are particularly reactive, or if they are have long atmospheric lifetimes, those things don't need to be assessed at all in order for them to be deemed safe for the market, safe for use. And it is sort of an, I suppose, ignorance is bliss situation at the moment in terms of these products and the regulations. But then you also have to consider the fact that there isn't a set way for these to be measured. So if you ask the manufacturer to do that, there isn't sort of a way that they would know how to measure these emissions, because it's not something that's on their radar at all. Which is part of what we try to do. We try to get manufacturers of all sorts of products, both aerosol and non-aerosol, to understand that VOC emissions are being emitted from their products, and maybe they need to consider reformulation and measurements before they go onto the market. So I suppose people who are particularly vulnerable, so those with respiratory diseases, asthma and things like that, will be using these products, but particularly for things such as sunscreens. Some of them are formulated for children. They're one of the only personal care products that are used by children, and they're particularly or more vulnerable to inhalation exposure to VOCs than adults are. So yeah, this personal exposure is something that's not been looked into a lot. And very personally, I think it should be. So it's not just the types of products that are, or the types of VOCs and the products used that influence, indoor emissions. It's also, how and when the products are used. So the frequency of the product use. They influence the exposure and also, any indoor air chemistry that might be going on. with room surface and temperature, and the occupancy, or also the room size and the ventilation. You know, if you're in a smaller room with less ventilation, you're going to have a higher exposure to VOCs in that indoor environment. Now, I'm just going to touch on ventilation quickly because ventilation, no doubt, is a very, very important part of any indoor air quality strategy. There's no denying that. And in fact, in the 2019 Clean Air Strategy, it was, you know, mentioned as in fact the only strategy for improving indoor air quality. It was a very small, maybe 1 or 2 lines that said, our recommendation for improving indoor air quality is to open a window. From a professional view, I don't think that's particularly good advice. It's not very well thought out. First of all, opening a window isn't, in most cases, going to be good enough to fully ventilate a space, or ventilate it well enough that you're not going to be exposed to VOCs. For that, you're going to need mechanical ventilation. It also doesn't take into consideration that there are rooms in people's houses that perhaps don't have windows, or the windows don't open very far. So again, mechanical ventilation would be needed. But having a good mechanical ventilation system doesn't mean that people are going to use them. And a lot of people don't. They can be noisy and intrusive. They may cost people money to either install them or change them. And a lot of people don't realise that in order for them to work effectively, they need to be regularly cleaned. I know I don't regularly clean the ventilation that I have in my house. Then you have this problem with insulation. Again, been in the news quite a lot recently. We want to be insulating our houses really well so that we can conserve the heating or the cooling, you know, to, you know, bring down our bills and, you know, use less fossil fuels in order to heat and cool our homes. But in order to do that, that limits the ventilation. So there needs to be some sort of, I suppose, balance between making sure that houses are well insulated, but also that they are also well ventilated, which is a very difficult thing to do. And the biggest downside to just having ventilation as a solution to poor indoor air quality is that at the end of the day, these pollutants or their secondary products are just going to be moved outside. So whilst that's great if you're just looking at indoor air quality, it's not great if you're you know, an outdoor air quality chemist, because say, you know, the bulk propellant from your VOCs, if all of those are just being directly moved outside, well, then you've got an outdoor air quality problem. So I suppose the main takeaway is that whilst, yes, we need to be improving ventilation, and ventilation is incredibly important to making sure that you are not exposed to high levels of VOCs indoors, it cannot be the sole solution to poor indoor air quality. And what we really need to do is think about occupant behaviour in terms of VOC activities, such as the use of consumer products, but also the reformulation of these products to be lower in their VOC emissions. So that's all I've got. That's, you know, sort of a broad view of all the things that I do in terms of measuring of VOCs, understanding of the products, inhalation exposure, and all those sorts of things. There's quite a few people I'd like to thank. You know, I couldn't do this work on my own. In particular, my supervisor, Ali Lewis, but also the people who helped me quite a lot in the lab. That's Marvin Shaw, Steve Andrews, and Martin Ward. But also everybody who works here in WACL in particular, you know, PhD and master students who often are helping me down in the lab to get these measurements. I hope you found that interesting, and I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.